So we've heard a lot of speeches this week and last week, and maybe some of you guys thought you need a drink after all this. Maybe you got a nail, maybe you got a lager, maybe you wanted something a little bit stronger. Maybe you wanted some whiskey, U.S. whiskey to be precise. Mark Twain once said, "Too much of anything is bad, but too much good whiskey is barely enough." I'm sure most of you are at the age where you're drinking now, and maybe some of you even appreciate it. In this speech, you will learn not only what a bourbon whiskey is, but the history behind its creation, as well as some of the most notable brands of bourbon. So what is bourbon then? According to the international law, a whiskey is qualified as bourbon if it is made in the USA and is of 51 to 79% corn, as well as being aged for at least 2 years, although most age their whiskey for 4. The barrel for the aging must also be made of new oak and charred on the inside, although most distillers now use American white oak. It must also be distilled no more than 160 proof or 80% of alcohol per volume. And nothing can be added to the bottle to enhance the flavor, color, or sweetness. So, what does bourbon whiskey have to do with the USA exactly? The drink itself goes back to the late 1700s, when early Scottish and Irish immigrants started distilling whiskey in western Pennsylvania. Eventually using corn instead of rye and other grains due to the lack of being able to grow enough. This is how the drink was produced. The name itself comes from Bourbon County, which is in central bluegrass regions of Kentucky. And the county itself was named after a French royal family in 1785, as well as being the host to major transshipment of distilled liquor down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans, which shipments of from the county would be stamped or labeled as bourbon. Elijah Craig, who this is a woodcut picture of, is credited with popularizing the name bourbon whiskey. As the story goes, he had a cellar full of whiskey and unfortunately got caught in a fire. So instead of just throwing out the rest that managed to survive, he decided to ship it out anyways. And those that got shipped out, being in the charred barrels, became distilled, and people began to call this bourbon whiskey. Though bourbon can be produced anywhere in the USA, nearly all brands are produced in Kentucky. Although there are no longer any distilleries in Bourbon County, only the state of Kentucky can produce bourbon with its name on the label. Many of the brands that are produced in Kentucky are some of the most popular and well-known whiskeys around. 10 of the most notable bourbons are Maker's Mark, which has been around for over 50 years and was first introduced in 1958. There's no actual set aging time for a particular bottle, but it's roughly estimated to be about 6 to 7 years. Knob Creek Bourbon is another one, which is produced by Jim Beam brand, which is one of the largest distilleries of producing any bourbon. Four Roses Whiskey. This was created in the 19th century and was sold even during the Prohibition. After being purchased by Seagram's, it was only sold overseas. There was no, they did not allow it to be sold in the U.S. And it wasn't until 2002 that it finally returned back to the States. Woodford Reserve Whiskey. This was created in 1996, which is pretty surprising because most people actually think it's a lot older than that. And it is also the official whiskey of the Kentucky Derby. Blanton's Bourbon. And this was created in 1984 and is responsible for inspiring the trend of single barrel bourbons. And then possibly the most popular is Jack Daniel's whiskey. And if you'll notice that it actually says Tennessee whiskey on the picture, and that most people confuse that. It is actually a bourbon legally, but Jack Daniel's refuses to call it bourbon. They like to call it Tennessee better. Here's another picture. This is Wild Turkey whiskey. And this right here is Old Rip Van Winkle whiskey. Another popular whiskey is Elijah Craig whiskey, which is named after Elijah Craig. And Jim Beam. This, like I said, largest brand of whiskey, bourbon whiskey, and produced like almost half of these on the list. So. Of these 10 whiskeys, I'm sure most of you have tried at least one by now. And the reasons why you should try it if you haven't are bourbon is a unique type of whiskey which is produced here only in America. And as such, it is part of our history and our culture. Bourbon whiskey is some of the most recognizable whiskeys also in the world. So this Halloween weekend, when you guys are thinking, what should you drink? Just definitely have some bourbon.
I feel hungover just after listening to the speech. Whiskey.
Simon, what did you think?
Good speech overall. Natural tone throughout the whole thing. Pretty good, solid hook. I really enjoyed that whole beginning where you kind of reminded us about all the other speeches and kind of went on to focus on your own. I kind of missed like the purpose statement. Like it was kind of unclear for me. But generally, it was pretty informative with all the whiskey and the bourbon going on. But kind of towards the middle, when you were presenting all the whiskeys, it kind of felt like a commercial for me. Like you were just listing all the whiskeys, but it was just like, you know, one after another, and I felt like I was kind of going through a Bevmo or something. Yeah, and then you did kind of go back to your purpose statement by declaring at the end, you know, you should drink it because it's part of our heritage. But I think that theme didn't carry out as well in the middle, but overall I think it was pretty informative. I enjoyed it a lot.
Okay. I liked in the attention device that you made references to earlier speeches. I thought that worked pretty well, and I thought you did give us a pretty good hook on that. You know, it's a general subject. Your goal is set up to kind of give us background and introduce us to those subjects. Your main ideas were laid out early on in the speech, but in the body of the speech, I didn't really hear a very clear structure. And in one segment, it just seems to be a list, and the list might have some interesting elements to it, but it's not really doing a lot to add to our knowledge of the topic. I think that you want to give us some source citations on the historical information that you're presenting. I think there's some pretty good data there, but you need to make sure that you cite it. I thought it was interesting you made reference to Elijah Craig early in the process, then you come back and that's one of the whiskeys that you're talking about. Make sure that you tie that in. I'm not sure everybody was paying attention and would remember that that's the person that was largely responsible for establishing it in